We started singing, and people's hearts would change. You could just see it.
Let us be one in you. Let us be one.
The Jesus Revolution exploded.
Expo 72 was an event in Dallas, Texas. It was sort of the idea of Christian Woodstock. First time many of these people had ever seen any hippies actually minister with music and rock and roll and all that.
The music of Love Song was part of the soundtrack of the last great American revival.
I think that we successfully communicate the gospel very effectively through music. That's to me what Love Song has always been about.
It is my great honor to induct Love Song into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. Love you guys.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Embracing Brokenness Podcast. If you're tracking with us, the last episode I had with me Chuck Girard, which was part one of a three-part series that we're doing featuring Chuck's life, his ministry, his music with Love Song. And many of you remember, you may have been alive, but even if you weren't, you probably saw the Jesus Revolution movie that was recently released and is, I believe, going to be available on Netflix here pretty soon as well. So Chuck is a great guy. I have just so enjoyed hanging out with him for a couple hours and just doing this interview. And I wanted to invite you back here for part two when we go a little bit deeper into his music, his ministry after he got saved out of drugs and alcohol and a lot of other issues that early on in his life impacted how he saw himself, how he viewed others. And so I am so thrilled to have Chuck back for part two. And here we are again on the Embracing Brokenness Podcast with Chuck Girard. And that, I think it's just all great backdrop for this transition. You mentioned your hippie quest. You went off to, I guess it was Hawaii, and then back to OC and Salt Lake, and then back again. You had this sort of thing you were going through. Take us through this transition for you that led to the sort of this quest that you mentioned.
Yeah, that was the hardest part of the book to vet, because all those trips back and forth to Salt Lake City and who was there, different people were in Salt Lake. Pretty straight. How I got into the hippie thing, I was the last thing from a hippie. I was in a do-up kind of group when we all wore the same suits and had our hair done the same way. So I was not at all understanding why these people were growing their hair long, try to look like Jesus, and take specifically LSD had my curiosity. I was actually not into drugs yet. I was an alcoholic, but I'd never smoked weed or anything like that until then. And so I started to get real interested in what was going on with that scene. And then little by little, because I was curious about it, my antenna went up and I found some marijuana. Somehow I got a hold of some marijuana, and I smoked weed for about a year. And that was a kind of a life-changing thing. But I was still really curious about LSD. And after about a year of marijuana, somehow I think we were playing in Vegas, and there was a band playing there that was dropping all the time and going and playing on it. They were totally committed. Yeah. And I got my first tab from them. And so then I started taking LSD, and that was really the life changer. This is something I had to be very careful with in the book, because there was a tremendous impact on my life from the taking of LSD. Right. It felt like it just elevated me into this place that I didn't know existed. Almost like parts of my mind opened up. Timothy Leary said, tune in, turn on, drop out. Right. And I understood that from a firsthand viewpoint at that point. But here's the deal, and I always like to be very careful to say that it is a spiritual experience. There's no, a counterfeit dollar bill is a thing that looks like a dollar bill. It's made of paper. You hand it to somebody, you buy something. And in that sense, it's real, this experience, but it's counterfeit. It's set up by the powers of darkness and controlled by them. And it's pharmakeia in the Bible, which is the word that we get pharmacy from, which means witchcraft. So Not knowing all that, though, we just thought it was a part of what was going on with finding God. That's what I thought. I thought drugs were a part of the steps to finding God. And I became very committed to LSD, the LSD lifestyle, for about 3 years. And so one thing led to another, and I kept dropping acid. And there's a whole interwoven story here about a band called the Fifth Cavalry that I'll have to kind of go back and very quickly bring into the story. About the time I got the LSD, we were playing in Las Vegas, and we met this band called Fifth Cavalry. Of one of the members of that band was a guy named Denny Correll, which some Christian music fans might remember. Denny was one of the great singers of contemporary Christian music. Denny's gone to be with the Lord many years ago, due to back problems, by the way, and maybe some of the drugs involved with that. He was found in his car in a parking lot at university. So I don't know what happened, but he went to heaven. And but anyhow, he was in this band, and he was preaching Jesus under the influence of drugs. And we were very fascinated with the whole thing of the Bible and Christianity and music. So they were from Orange County, and after they finished their Las Vegas run, I think we were playing on the bill with them. We both finished our runs, and I was living in Orange County at that time. So we'd go down to watch the band because they were fabulous. They were just unbelievable. They did all these cover versions of songs. They all played horns. They had seen Sly and the Family Stone at the same club that I told you that my experience.
You're right. Oh my
A
God.
different night.
Yeah.
And their life, they said, we got to get trumpets. And so they started doing all the trumpet with one hand and keyboard with the other.
Yeah.
But they were just astonishing to watch and very, very polished, very good. So we became friends with them, and we started hanging out with them. And there was a guy we met through them, a guy named George Grenier, who was sort of became our spiritual guru for a while. He was very influential in our connecting with the Bible, but still into the drug scene. And we would have Bible studies under the influence of drugs. And he decided that that's how we made it to Hawaii. He decided that Kauai was the where the New Jerusalem was going to come back, because he hypothesized that it was the purest place on earth, which it wasn't, but that was what he said. So long story short, we all sold everything that we had. I sold my house in Pasadena. I owned a house because I had taken over the mortgage from my mother. And we became real hippies. Denny and his family came. Denny and his wife and 2 daughters, who were infants. They were like just 6 weeks old kind of thing. All moved to Hawaii and tried to live off the land and do all this stuff and be spiritual and find God. Well, they couldn't take it. Their kids they were too young. The kids were too young. So after a couple of weeks, Denny came and said, we're going back to the mainland. So now I'm on my own in Hawaii, and I'm sort of hanging out. And I started in Kauai. I wound up somehow on Oahu, and I was living near the North Shore at the time in a little hippie flop house. Yeah. You'd go find a little corner and put up your what is it, the pattern paisley curtain, and lay your sleeping bag, and that was your quarters. So I'm out on the beach one day. I bought this little 3/4 size guitar, and I was learning to play guitar. And this guy comes walking down the beach, and he's coming toward me, and I go like, "Who is this approaching me?" Turns out to be Jay Truax, who became the bass player in Love Song. Yeah. And Jay had gone to Salt Lake City and started a very successful trio band. They had an agent in Salt Lake City, and the agent got them on all the big shows in Salt Lake City that came through, which included people like Janis Joplin and Three Dog Night and Creedence Clearwater, and even opened for the Grateful Dead. So Jay's band was hot stuff in Salt Lake City. They were the band in town, and they were toying with the idea of adding keyboards. So Jay flew over. They were making really good bank at that time, and Jay flew over to Hawaii to get me. Wow. He hands me an airline ticket, and he says, "We want you to come to Salt Lake and see if you can join the band." So he took off. It was separate trips, and he went back to the mainland, and I collected everything, and I got on a plane and I flew to Salt Lake City. And it never worked out with the band. I was not a good enough musician to be directly honest about it. They were like powerhouse trio. They were amazing musicians, and I just didn't fit in. I couldn't keep up with them. But I stayed in Salt Lake for a year and lived with Jay, and then ultimately made it back to Orange County. But by the time we went to Hawaii, what had happened was I had, like I say, I had sold my home to make some money to live on while we were in Hawaii. And then he went back to the mainland. And so now I'm back to the story where here's Jay, comes from Salt Lake City to get me, hands me the ticket. Bottom line is we're getting teed up now for the Lord to clean our clocks, okay? And we're living in the beach. Somehow somebody must have put a suit on and gone and rented this beautiful house overlooking the ocean. It was way up on a hill in Laguna Beach, and it wasn't a big house. It wasn't luxurious, but it was beautiful area. And we lived there communally, but we're all miserable. Many of us, several of us had already been arrested for drugs, and I spent a day in jail, Orange County jail. You say a day, just a day? Well, what was happening in Orange County in those days is there were so many hippies. This is new stuff for the cops. Hippies with marijuana. Everybody had marijuana, so they would arrest hippies. They didn't have enough jail space, so they'd give you a slap on the hand. They put you in jail and then you're out, so they could put the next hippie in. So I spent a day in jail. Some of the other guys had been arrested, and we had made this trip to Salt Lake City to bring some hashish to our friends, and I got arrested in Las Vegas. Now, Las Vegas was scary in those days. Las Vegas had signs. You can Google it. Don't mess with drugs. Don't gamble with drugs in Las Vegas. And it would say possession, 25 years, dealing life. So, you know, we were just trying to get around Las Vegas, but God had other ideas. You had to go through a little 2-3 block section of town to get from freeway to freeway. And in that 3-block section, I'm convinced God set it up. This patrol cars driving alongside of us, and we're all saying, "Be cool, just get through town." And they pull us over and they bust us. Okay, supposedly they found weed. I think it was planted because they had searched us for about 20 minutes and not found anything. And all of a sudden, this cop comes back with a roach that he supposedly found on the engine. And in those old vans, the engine cover's in plain view. You know, it's like this sound. You remember those vans?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we got arrested, went back to Orange County, and now the scene is set for our conversion experience, because we're all living up there, but we're all miserable and nobody's happy. Everybody's got trials ahead of them. I had actually quit LSD because I'd had a very frightening experience in Salt Lake City where I had felt totally alone, without the absence of love or anything. And it was devastating, crushingly dark, and just like almost like you couldn't stand it. And if it had lasted more than a few seconds, I don't know what would have happened. So I just decided, it scared me, and I said, no more LSD for me. And I kept true to that, but I was still smoking weed and hashish. And so we're up there still doing some drugs. And what we would do when we would pick up hitchhikers when we drove along Pacific Coast Highway, because hippies would often have a lit of weed and they'd offer you a joint. You know, you could get free drugs that way and help a hippie out, right? So now picking up hippies and they're asking us if we know Jesus. Now we're looking for God, you know, so we're going like, where did you find Jesus? Calvary Chapel. So we keep hearing about Calvary Chapel, and this was uncanny. I have recorded a song that's coming out on a new album I'm doing now, my first studio album in decades. And it's called Was That Jesus? And it's actually based on this season of my life where everywhere I looked, I saw signs of Jesus. These were days where no one had stickers, "Jesus loves you," nothing like that. And there was a store in Orange County, I remember. In fact, I was just talking to somebody that was, it's called W.T. Grant's on Newport Avenue, and they sold jeans, and they just either moved the store or sold it or whatever. But I went in to get some jeans, and I walked into the dressing room, and "Jesus loves you" was on the wall. And I went, whoa. And everywhere I looked, it was like I see these signs of Jesus, and I'm going, what's going on here? You know, just pointing me toward the Lord. So anyhow, these hippies talking about Jesus and this, that, and the other thing. And we knew about, there was a hippie commune in Newport Beach called the Blue Top.
It was like a motel. Blue Top was like a motel, right? Was it?
It was was one of those one-story,
Yes.
drive-up deals, L-shaped. And Calvary Chapel had either bought it.
Right.
I've heard a couple of stories. It was either in escrow for a year for another sale. I've also heard they were going to tear it down. But whatever, during the interim time, the realtor, who was a Christian, had said the hippies could live in there, and they made a communal house out of it. And Lonnie Frisbee was the elder of that commune.
Right.
So one night, this is all in the process of this time where we're beginning to hear everything about Jesus, and it's coming up everywhere in our conversation. We were also reading the Bible through this whole 2-3 year period all the time, as well as Eastern philosophy books and Timothy Leary and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And one night we're up in our little house up in Laguna Beach, and we're having a Bible study, and the subject of speaking in tongues comes up. Well, I had an experience with tongues. I used to take my guitar up. We had this beautiful view of the ocean and a nice tree you could lean against. That's just up the hill from us, half a block up the hill. And I would go up there and I'd play my guitar, and I would sing in I would call it, free form.
Yeah.
I didn't make up words. I'm just going to sing sounds. And so it was tongues,
Wow.
a version of tongues.
Wow.
And so I would babble on in musical language and all that stuff. But it would bring this darkness. And I did it twice. And the first time it was like, oh, this isn't good. I didn't know about demons or darkness. I just knew this wasn't good. And so I put my guitar down and walk in the house. This happened twice. So now we're talking about tongues from the Bible, and I'm going, guys, I don't know why that's bad. I had tongues. I did that. That's not good. But it was in the Bible, so we had to deal with it. So we thought, well, let's go down to the Blue Top, because those guys are more Christians than we are. We were sort of on our way to Christianity, but we weren't Christians yet, committed, but we knew they were. So we said, well, let's go down and ask them about this. They must know the Bible better than we do. So we drove the 15 miles down to Newport Beach to the Blue Top. And I don't know, we just picked number one, I guess, unit, and we knocked on the door. And these guys must have been flabbergasted. They probably just had their evening. It was about 7 o'clock. They probably just finished eating. They're probably having prayer time. Lord, send us souls that we can get them saved. And then
That's
there's
great. I love it.
hippies with a Bible in their hand saying, what do you know about tongues? Well, I don't remember that we ever really got into what tongues were all about, but they told us about Chuck Smith, and they told us about their church, and they were inviting us. They basically wanted to evangelize us and get us to church. Well, I was still wary of Christianity. I'd had my bad experience as a Catholic, as a younger person. I rejected it when I was about 15. I didn't want to find God in Christianity. I wanted to find God on a mountaintop with a guru,
Interesting.
or some kind of Eastern thing that was more appealing and more sexy, really, than following God and picking up your cross and all that stuff. But I thought, if you're going to be an honest seeker, you have to check it out, because this could be different than what you experienced when you were a kid. And you have to be really, my attitude was, I can go in and check it off my list. At least I've been there. I saw what it was, and it wasn't for me. Well, of course, God had a different idea. And I drove, it was about probably a half a mile or a mile around Calvary Chapel in those days. They were big, long blocks, still are today. And every time I drive around, I try to get the courage to go in, and I go, I'll go around one more time. Maybe you should go home. So finally, about the 5th time around, I thought, okay, do it. It was almost like something took my hands and drove me into the parking lot.
Of
Just
course.
go in, get it over with. So I did. I walked into the back. I sat on the back row toward the edge of the row so that I could get out if I wanted to make my escape. And the first thing that hit me were these hippie kids were coming up, and they were sharing songs God had, quote, given them, right? And some of them sounded like he gave it to them because he didn't want them. They were like, they weren't sometimes good songs. They were but they were penetrating me, this musical snob that was into Pink Floyd and all this stuff. Why are these songs affecting me so deep? I didn't know anything about the anointing or any of that stuff.
Sure.
Music. So I'm sitting here being impacted by these songs, and God just grabs hold of my heart. I don't remember anything from the sermon. I just remember God just speaking to my heart. I have to tell you that my spiritual philosophy at that time was based on kind of the new age hippie idea that's been around for years, that all of humanity is a fabric, and we all work together, and John Lennon, I'm in you and you're in me, and we are all together. And I felt like everybody had to come to some sort of peace with God before all people had to come to that before there could be a oneness with all humans. So I had to hold up my end of the bargain, and I had to try to walk. We weren't doing sexual things. We were separating certain sinful activity. We didn't realize the drugs were wrong yet, but we were actually living pretty pure lives because we wanted to please God.
Right.
And so all of a sudden I realized that the Holy Spirit turned that around in my mind. I can't even explain how it happened. That I felt like I was carrying everybody else on my shoulders because I was trying to keep up my end of the bargain of the fabric of humanity, so that everyone could come there to that same place of realization, and we could all be one with God. So the Holy Spirit kind of moved me into the idea of, this is between you and God. You get you right first, and then don't worry about everybody else. God will take care of all that. And I somehow intuitively understood that, and this weight lifted off me, physical weight. Like this darkness and all this stuff just pulled off me, and I felt light, and I was laughing and I was crying, and people next to me must have just thought I was going nuts. Well, I kind of was.
Wow.
And so that was the night that I feel I surrendered to the Lord, but I didn't go forward for the altar call. I wasn't in that place yet. I knew that sometimes they had that in the meetings, but I made a deal with God. I said, look, this feels right. This feels like where I should be, but you've taken me through other levels, and because we had already pretty much rejected the whole idea of the Eastern philosophy thing, where it's almost like a video game where you have to keep achieving the levels and all that.
Right. Yes.
Kind of abandon all that. So we had it narrowed down a little bit, and I said, well, if this is not the final step, if this is another stepping stone to the next level of whatever you want to bring me into, I'm open, but I'm here fully committed till you tell me different. And that's now 53 years ago, and I never looked back, and I never had a reason to look back. Later on, I did do an altar call. We had already gotten baptized under the influence of drugs like a year before. I went and got rebaptized. Chuck Smith baptized me in a swimming pool at his home just to make sure that it stuck.
It took. Yeah, I get it. Get it.
And so that was my conversion experience. And, we started attending Calvary. They had something at Calvary every night. And we started going. When I say we, I bring you up to speed. There's several of the guys in the house received Jesus around the same 2 to 3 week period. This was God's plan to put a band together, I'm convinced. And so Fred went over to Melodyland and got saved there through a chick tract, a Melodyland tract. And some of them got saved at Calvary Chapel. But anyhow, there's about 4 of us now that are saved, and we're going to church together at Calvary. And that's kind of brings us up to that point in the story.
So this is the beginning of Love Song, right? As you would put it. And one of the coolest stories, and I remember actually hearing Chuck, and I met him a few times here at Calvary Chapel, Philly, and he told the story here. And it's, I think I've seen it also recorded in other places. You have it in the book about what happened at that point. Here you are, a couple of weeks or a few weeks into making this decision to follow the Lord, and he invites, or you feel something come over you and you approach Chuck. Tell us how that all happened, and how you first played music at Calvary Chapel.
It is one of the best stories in our history. And fortunately, the night that we did our reunion thing in 2010,
right,
he told that story, and it's on YouTube, but we're using it in our documentary. We're doing a documentary of our band. And that is
I saw that, Chuck. I'm going to actually insert in this for folks the trailer for that documentary, but I'll put it in here so people can see it.
It was a time of change.
It was a grand experiment, and underneath it, I think it was a hunger to know God and truth.
Where do we go from here? Enter the Jesus movement.
God's Spirit swept across the country.
Well, let the people know Jesus is the Lord.
You could feel the presence of God in the music.
Love Song would hear his voice.
Back in 1970, these hippies came in.
They were actually pioneers of writing songs that spoke to people outside the walls of the church.
Wow, these guys are like a combination between the Beatles and the Beach Boys.
Little country church on the edge of town.
Their songs would become part of the soundtrack of the Jesus movement.
Hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, got saved during that Jesus movement.
Love Song was a vehicle to spread the gospel with young people at that time.
The Jesus People movement and Love Song in particular, God did an incredible thing in my family's life, which has impacted me.
We started singing, and people's hearts would change. You could just see it.
Let us be one in you. Let us be one.
The Jesus Revolution exploded.
Expo 72 was an event in Dallas, Texas. It was sort of the idea of Christian Woodstock. First time many of these people had ever seen any hippies actually minister with music and rock and roll and all that.
The music of Love Song was part of the soundtrack of the last great American revival.
I think that we successfully communicate the gospel very effectively through music. That's to me what Love Song has always been about.
It is my great honor to induct Love Song into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. Love you guys.
So listen now to a love song.
Love Song. The band, the ministry, the movement.
In the movie, The Jesus Revolution, in which we haven't even talked about that, the fact that portrayed in that movie, not very well, I must say.
I know.
But okay.
Yeah.
They say our name, and it's been great for us.
Yes.
But, Lonnie character comes into Chuck's house, and he says, I met these guys in a coffee shop, and we're playing in Chuck's living room. Well, that never happened.
Okay.
The real story is that we had been at Calvary for about, a couple of weeks. We were just 2 or 3 weeks old in the Lord, but we had been writing these songs about our quest for God, and many of them about 6 of them wound up on the first Love Song album. So we'd gotten pretty close in our lyrics. Chuck Smith would always vet the lyrics, of course, but we had very few changes we ever had to make because we were getting it right even before we were Christians. So we had these songs, and we liked Lonnie. And we thought, how cool that Lonnie looks like Jesus and we look like Crosby, Stills and Nash, Pink Floyd or something. Let's go see if the pastor would let us play. So we went into Calvary Chapel. It was a Wednesday, and it was youth night that night. And so we walked into the office. We didn't you never had to get a meeting with anybody. That was very loosey-goosey Calvary. It was very hippie, even though Chuck wasn't a hippie. So he comes out to the sanctuary with us, and he kind of interviews us, so to speak, and asks us our test. How did you guys come to the Lord? And later on, years later, he told me, he said, there was nothing in my mind that was going to have you guys play. 3 weeks old to the Lord, and drums and long hair. They had a group like that before we got there, but they were more folky. They were called the Joy Band. Okay. And they had Children of the Day, who were more of a straight as kind of band. But we were the first kind of real rock and rollers from out in rock and roll society. So he was ambivalent about it. But at the end of the little meeting, he said, well, play me a song at least, So we went and got our guitars or whatever we did, and we played Welcome Back for him.
Welcome Back, yeah.
And it totally just wrecked him. I mean, he was just, in fact, when he tells the story, as you've probably seen that clip at 2010, he gets all choked up. He can't talk. Yeah. Because the Holy Spirit fell on him. And the next thing we heard was, he says, can you guys play tonight? It's youth night. And Lonnie's speaking. Well, there's our dream come true. So we started that night. We played our first time. We did not yet have full electric thing going. We were playing bongos and acoustic guitars. And the place exploded. I won't say because of us, but in my own interpretation of those events, I believe that we were the last element in place before God lowered the boom on the hippies, because that place was going to be the media focal point, and we were his band. Not to take anything away from any other band. There were great bands at Calvary, but I do believe that Love Song had a specific role in the very beginnings of that explosion. And the church grew from a couple of hundred to 2,000 in about 4 months. And then we moved into the circus tent, which was not
right.
quite like in the movie. That was a great choice for the movie because it looked great. But this was really an old olive drab army looking circus tent kind of thing. And so the place grew exponentially. The media got on board. They began to see that the news item was hippies were getting saved in great numbers, or finding God, they'd call it.
Yes.
Rolling Stone magazine came down. They sent a reporter, and they
I
said,
remember that. And even Ann Leibovitz, right? The photographer came down. Yeah.
Anybody that knows anything about rock photography, she's
Yes.
one of the 2 or 3 icons of rock photography. So we were photographed by Annie Leibovitz. And so that's the kind of atmosphere it was then. You'd come in on a Wednesday night and they'd be setting up the lights for ABC, NBC to do a documentary of not just us, by the way. There was other stuff going on in the nation. There was Scott Ross had the Freeville thing with Phil Keaggy was. There was stuff happening up in Berkeley. So they would take film of all these different things that were going on and then put it all together. And it'd be on the very next week. There'd be a special on Jesus movement or whatever. So that was the climate. And it was just mind-boggling as we became so well known because we were usually the band that was playing when they did the promotion or they came to do the coverage of what was happening. So our band became very well known very quickly. We had never even ventured out of Calvary Chapel at that point. And now we started to get invitations to play other churches. In fact, I had to go. I went to Chuck Smith and I said, are we supposed to do some? We feel like we're committed to Calvary. Can we go somewhere else? Oh yeah, boys, your ministry is not just for us. And eventually we toured and everything and got into the mainstream, but that was the beginning of it. And we watched that church. I mean, altar calls were amazing. I'm not exaggerating when I say that sometimes 50, 60 or more % of the audience would come to the front to receive Jesus for the first time because hippies were telling their friends. We have that line in our song, Two Hands, with one hand reach out to Jesus and with the other bring up a pen. Boy, they were doing that in great numbers. Everybody was telling their friends about Calvary. Of course, you had something cool to invite them to. It wasn't like, come to my dead, drab church with old guy suits on. Come see these bands and come. It was a happening. And some people criticized it because of that. They said, well, when you become too popular, something's wrong. And that is generally, I feel that there's some truth to that. But in this case, it was just something that God was doing that was very, it was affecting a whole generation. People talk about, can we have this again, another Jesus movement? Well, I believe, of course we can. God's always moving. All that was a little chunk of God moving and somebody put a label on it and branded it Jesus movement. But here's the uniqueness. I don't know of any other time, maybe in history. Well, certainly this part is unique, that there's so much population on the earth at this time, about late 60s, right?
Yes.
All the counterculture is hippies. I mean, you just had some beatniks in San Francisco and a few little things going on. Not to say that it wasn't some, but as far as the general world, everyone was turned on to what was happening with the hippies. This was something going on all over the world. And you had all of this being driven, elevated by music of the Beatles. And, when the Beatles came out and Dylan did too, said, we've dropped LSD, we felt affirmed. We thought, oh, wow, they're on our trip, the Beatles, man. Yes. And then we started looking for lyrics in there, Sgt. Pepper, what's the hidden message? And then Magical Mystery Tour was an even more spiritual album to me. It had Blue Jay Way, All My Friends Have Gone Astray. It had Magical Mystery Tour, all these implications of spiritual advancement, if you will. Then comes the White Album, and we're looking at this double album. They don't even have their name on it. They're kind of embossed in there. It's not even in color. It's just the Beatles down there, kind of, if you look close. And we thought, oh, this is it. This is the album. It's going to reveal all truth to us. It looked like, white, the Holy Spirit, the dove, whatever. And the songs were like Rocky Raccoon and Why Don't We the Road, and we're kind of good.
I have that album over here on the shelf, by the way. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. It was an album, too. So that kind of began to shatter the dream. Now, to make my point, here we are, late 69, and everybody's at the same point of disenchantment about many people. I won't say everybody, but many hippies. Here's where hippies went one of two ways at that point. They either went back into the world and became the yuppies of the 70s,
right,
or they wanted more of God, and they were ripe for the Jesus movement because that had never been really part of it. I mean, it was part of it, but we'd never really discovered the reality of the Bible. So it's low-hanging fruit at this point. It's all these kids at the same place, all prepared for the next step, which is Jesus. So it was really easy to bring them into the kingdom. I remember going to Canada the first time. In Vancouver we played, and we expected the same thing. Well, we'll have an altar call, and out of the 100 people or 200 that are here, 20 and 30 will come up to the. Nobody comes to the altar call. We go, what's going on? Well, it wasn't their season yet. They had their. Well, we started a few years later at St. Margaret's, I think, in Vancouver with, what was that guy's name? Bob. He was the Chuck Smith of Canada, but it came. Yeah. So we learned that. We were learning as we go. We were baby Christians. We were learning about all this as we go. But we had these fabulous altar calls in the States all the time, wherever we went. And then we, that leads into the baptisms where we didn't have a place to baptize them. So we dunk them in the ocean. But what a season, what a time to become a Christian and to have this influence in this music that impacted so many people. And as we're making this documentary, which, by the way, we've titled A Band Called Love Song. We went through all these weird, cool titles, and we thought, you know what? This is what it should be called. It's about, we're not the band, we're a band, and we're just called. So we landed on that. And just in retrospect, today I understand more of our impact than I ever did then. When you hear these testimonies from people like Michael W. Smith and these guys, see, I had Elvis, right? Elvis influenced. Well, I'm going to listen to every Elvis record there is, and then I became. They were listening to us as their Elvis.
That's amazing when you think about, the influence that what God did through you and through Love Song, and the influence that had in all contemporary Christian music, which is what it ultimately became known as. It's to this day. I mean, look at so you can never take for granted the amazing, the Jesus movement and at its core has been affecting lives in the United States, around the world ever since. It's got to be one of the greatest movement of the Spirit that we've seen in generations. It has to be.
Well, I think that it's probably the biggest thing we've seen in our lifetime.
What a great story to be part of, something like Chuck was part of and is still able to share his experiences with us even to this day. That's part 2. We have one more part in this 3-part series in my interview with Chuck Girard. So please come back next time on the Embracing Brokenness podcast.
This was another episode of the Embracing Brokenness podcast. For more information on Embracing Brokenness Ministries, or to subscribe to our blog, podcast, YouTube channel, or engage with us on social media, please visit our website at embracingbrokenness.org. Thanks for joining us.